Either Part 1. The afternoon sun hung heavy over Copper Creek, casting long shadows between the weathered storefronts that lined Main Street. Dust rose in lazy spirals with each hoofbeat, each creak of wagon wheels, painting the air a rusty gold that settled on everything like a fine coating of memory. The town moved at the pace of heat and necessity, slow, deliberate, with the weight of survival pressed into every gesture. Sister Mary Catherine stood before the old post office. Her black habit faded to charcoal gray from countless washings in the relentless prairie sun. The fabric hung loose on her small frame. Speaking of meals skipped so that others might eat. In her arms, she cradled a wicker basket lined with faded gingham cloth, its contents precious beyond the simple appearance of day-old bread and oatmeal cookies baked from the last of their flour stores. Her hands, pale and slender as they were, bore the honest marks of labor, small cuts from mending wire fencing, calluses from hauling water buckets, and the permanent stain of lye soap under her fingernails. Yet her posture remained straight, her chin lifted with quiet dignity that no amount of hardship seemed able to bend. The orphanage sat 3 miles outside town, a collection of wooden buildings that had seen better decades. 27 children called it home, ranging from barely walking to nearly grown, each one a story of loss written in different chapters of the same hard book. Sister Mary Catherine had become mother, teacher, protector, and provider to them all, though she was scarcely 25 herself. She adjusted her grip on the basket and stepped toward the general store, her worn boots making soft sounds against the wooden sidewalk. The proprietor, Mr. Hensley, was a kind man when his wife wasn't watching, sometimes willing to trade her baked goods for salt, flour, or precious coffee beans. Today, she hoped for enough supplies to make the children's evening meal something more than water and yesterday's bread. The sound of spurs on wood made her pause. Sheriff Thomas Randall emerged from the saloon across the street, his shadow falling long and dark despite the afternoon hour. He was a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with hands that had grown soft from years of taking rather than earning. His badge caught the light as he adjusted his gun belt and fixed his pale eyes on her. "Sister," he called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of honey poured over bitter herbs. "Mighty warm day to be walking into town." Mary Catherine turned to face him, her expression calm but watchful. "Good afternoon, Sheriff Randall." He crossed the street with deliberate slowness, his boots striking each board with authority. When he reached her, he removed his hat, running thick fingers through thinning hair. "I've been meaning to ride out your way. Got some business to discuss." "Oh," her voice remained level, though her grip tightened slightly on the basket handle. "That orphanage of yours sits on prime land. Valley water runs right through it. Good grazing, perfect for expansion." His smile never reached his eyes. "Town's growing, sister. Progress don't wait for sentiment. The children need that land. Sheriff, it's their home. Children grow up, move on, but business is forever." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "County says there's back taxes owed, substantial amount. Be a shame if those little ones had to find new arrangements." Mary Catherine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "How substantial?" "More than a woman in your circumstances could manage. But I'm a reasonable man, sister. Reasonable men find solutions that benefit everyone." His eyes moved over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Perhaps we could discuss terms. Private-like." From across the street, a tall figure in a dusty brown coat paused in adjusting his horse's bridle. The stranger had the lean build of a man accustomed to long days in the saddle, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He'd been watching the exchange with growing interest, his hands stilling on the leather straps. "I'll need time to consider," Mary Catherine said, her voice steady despite the fear that had settled cold in her stomach. Randall's smile widened, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "Of course, but don't take too long, sister. County men don't like to wait, and winter's coming fast. Be terrible shame if those children had to face the cold without proper shelter." He replaced his hat and touched the brim in mock courtesy. "Good day to you," as he walked away, his spurs jangling with each step. Mary Catherine stood motionless for a long moment. The weight of his threat settled on her shoulders like a yoke, heavier than any physical burden she'd ever carried. 27 children depended on her, trusted her to keep them safe and fed and warm. The thought of them scattered to the winds, sent to workhouses or worse, made her chest tight with something approaching panic. The stranger across the street finished with his horse and began walking in her direction. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting against prairie sun, and the careful way he moved that suggested a man comfortable with both violence and restraint. His clothes were travel-worn but clean, his gun worn low but not displayed with the casual arrogance she'd come to associate with men like Randall. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim as he approached. "Couldn't help but notice you might be carrying something heavy there." Mary Catherine looked down at her basket, then back at him. There was something in his eyes, not pity, but a recognition of burden that suggested he understood the weight of responsibility. "It's nothing I can't manage. Thank you. Didn't say you couldn't manage it, just offered to help carry it." His voice held a gentle drawl, soft around the edges in a way that reminded her of her father's voice from long ago. "Name's Ethan Cole. I'm new to town." She studied his face for a moment, noting the honest set of his jaw and the way he kept his hands visible and still. "Sister Mary Catherine. I run the children's home outside town. You heard mention of it. Good work you're doing." He glanced in the direction Randall had gone, then back to her. "Sheriff seemed mighty interested in your business." "Sheriff Randall takes interest in many things that don't concern him." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and she immediately looked down at her hands. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sometimes a man's got to decide what kind of problems are worth having, and sometimes protecting something that matters is worth considerable trouble." Something in his tone made her look up again. Their eyes met and held for a heartbeat longer than politeness required. In that moment, with the afternoon light slanting golden between them and the dust settling around their feet, Mary Catherine made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a strength that surprised them both. "If you truly meant what you just said about protection being worth trouble..." She paused, drew a breath that seemed to pull courage from somewhere deep inside her chest. "If you promise to protect those children, I'll marry you." Part 2. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Ethan Cole stood perfectly still, his storm-gray eyes searching Mary Catherine's face for any hint that she spoke in jest or desperation-born madness. He found neither. Her chin remained lifted, her dark eyes steady and unflinching despite the color that had crept into her pale cheeks. The afternoon breeze stirred the edges of her faded habit, but she might as well have been carved from prairie stone for all she moved. This was not the wild declaration of a woman overcome by emotion, but the calculated decision of someone who had weighed every option and found them all wanting save one. "Sister," Ethan said slowly, his voice careful as a man walking on thin ice. "That's not something a person says lightly, No, she agreed, shifting the basket to one arm so she could smooth her skirts with her free hand. It's not, but neither is watching children go hungry or cold. Or worse. She looked past him toward the saloon where Randall had disappeared. I've prayed about this situation for weeks, Mr. Cole. Sometimes the Lord's answer comes in unexpected forms. Ethan removed his hat and ran his fingers through his dark hair, his mind working to catch up with the sudden turn their conversation had taken. He drifted into Copper Creek that morning with nothing more pressing on his mind than finding a decent meal and perhaps work for a few days before moving on. Now he stood facing a woman whose quiet desperation had just rewritten the trajectory of both their lives. "You don't know anything about me," he said finally. "I could be anyone, could be running from something, could be worse than whatever you're trying to protect those children from." Mary Catherine tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same careful attention she might give to a passage of difficult scripture. "Could be. But you stopped to help carry a stranger's burden without being asked? You noticed that Sheriff Randall was threatening me and didn't pretend it wasn't happening. And when you spoke about protection being worth trouble, you meant it. I can hear it in your voice. Still doesn't make me husband material. Perhaps not." She adjusted her grip on the basket again, a small gesture that betrayed the first hint of nervousness she'd shown. "But it might make you the kind of man who would keep his word if he gave it." The sound of a wagon rattling down Main Street filled the silence between them. Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store peered out at them from beneath her bonnet, her expression sharp with curiosity. Mary Catherine acknowledged her with a small nod but didn't step away from Ethan or lower her voice. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Marry me. Give the children legal protection through marriage that I cannot provide alone. Stand between them and men like Randall who see weakness where they should see innocence worth protecting." Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles had gone white where they gripped the basket handle. "In return, I would be whatever kind of wife you needed me to be." The last words came softer, and for the first time since she'd made her proposal, she looked away from his face. Ethan felt something twist in his chest at the vulnerability hidden beneath her practical tone. This woman was offering to sacrifice everything, her calling, her independence, possibly her happiness for the sake of children who had already lost everything once. "Sister Mary Catherine," he said gently, waiting until she met his eyes again. "Before we talk about marriage or anything else, when's the last time you and those children had a proper meal?" The question clearly caught her off guard. She blinked once, twice, as if trying to shift from talk of marriage contracts back to the mundane reality of empty pantries and hungry mouths. "We manage," she said automatically. "That's not what I asked." Her shoulders sagged slightly, the first crack in her composure. 3 days ago, Mrs. Patterson brought soup bones and some vegetables from her garden. Before that, she shrugged. "We make do with what we have." Ethan settled his hat back on his head and took a step toward the general store. "Come on then. First things first. Mr. Cole, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm deciding." He paused at the store's entrance and looked back at her. "And before you argue about charity or pride, think about those children. If you're serious about this marriage proposal, then providing for my family starts now." Mary Catherine stared at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her dark eyes. Slowly, she nodded and followed him into the dim interior of Hensley's general store. The store smelled of coffee beans and tobacco, leather and soap. "Mr. Hensley looked up from behind his counter, his weathered face creasing into a smile when he saw Mary Catherine. Sister brought something to trade today. Actually, Ethan said, stepping forward and placing several coins on the counter. We're buying flour, salt, coffee if you have it, bacon, beans, whatever vegetables you've got that'll keep, and candy for the children. Hensley's eyebrows rose as he looked between them. That's quite a list. Can you fill it? Well, yes, but... Then let's get started. Ethan turned to Mary Catherine. Anything else those children need? Medicine? Warm clothes? She was staring at him as if he'd just performed some impossible miracle. Mr. Cole, this is too much. I can't let you... Sister, he said quietly, mindful of Hensley's listening ears. If we're going to do this thing, we're going to do it right. Those children are going to eat tonight, and every night after that. That's my first promise to you. The simplicity of his words, the matter-of-fact way he spoke about providing for children he'd never met, seemed to steal whatever remaining resistance she might have offered. She nodded wordlessly and began helping Hensley gather their supplies. As they worked, filling burlap sacks with flour and beans, wrapping bacon in brown paper, Ethan found himself watching the woman beside him. Her movements were economical, practiced, the gestures of someone accustomed to making much from little. When Hensley offered her a peppermint stick to sample, she broke it in half automatically, saving one piece for later. For the children, no doubt. That should do it, Hensley announced, surveying the pile of goods on his counter. Quite a feast you're planning. Every day should be a feast when you've got people you care about to share it with, Ethan replied, counting out the coins. Outside, they loaded the supplies into Ethan's wagon. Mary Catherine moved with quiet efficiency, but he could see the questions building behind her eyes like storm clouds on the horizon. Mr. Cole, she said finally, as he secured the last sack with rope. I need to know. Are you considering my proposal? Or are you simply a kind man who feeds hungry children? Ethan finished tying the knot and straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows now, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. Sister, he said, meeting her steady gaze, I've been drifting for a long time. Never had much reason to stay anywhere or much worth protecting. But I've seen enough of the world to recognize something precious when it's offered to me. He paused, choosing his words carefully. So to answer your question, yes, I'm considering it. But first, I want to meet these children you're willing to sacrifice everything for. I want to see what I'd be promising to protect. Mary Catherine's face softened with something that might have been relief or gratitude or hope. Perhaps all three. Then follow me. Mr. Cole, let me show you what 27 reasons for living look like. Part 3. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the dusty road as they left Copper Creek behind, heading toward the low hills that marked the edge of the valley. Mary Catherine sat beside Ethan on the wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the familiar landscape roll past with eyes that seemed to see it differently now. The cottonwoods along the creek bed drooped in the heat, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind, while grasshoppers clicked and buzzed in the tall prairie grass. How long have you been running the orphanage? Ethan asked, his voice cutting through the rhythmic creak of the wagon. 3 years this October. She adjusted her position on the hard seat, mindful of the supplies shifting behind them. Sister Margaret, the woman who founded it, passed from consumption. I was barely out of the novitiate, but there was no one else. Mother Superior in Denver said they couldn't spare another sister. So you took on 27 children by yourself. 14 then. Word travels fast about a safe place for unwanted children. There was no bitterness in her voice, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned early that the world was harder than prayers alone could soften. Some are true orphans, parents dead from disease or accident. Others are simply inconvenient, children born the wrong way, or to the wrong people, or at the wrong time. Ethan glanced at her profile, noting the way her jaw tightened slightly when she spoke of inconvenient children. And you take them all? We take them all. The correction was gentle but firm. The Lord doesn't seem much concerned with convenience when it comes to loving his children. They crested a small rise, and the orphanage came into view. Ethan's first thought was that it looked like a place where hope went to die slowly. The main building was a 2-story wooden structure that had once been painted white but now showed more gray wood than paint. The roof sagged in places and several shutters hung askew. A smaller building, probably the dormitory, stood to one side, its chimney listing at an angle that suggested it had seen better decades. A vegetable garden stretched behind the buildings, neat rows of struggling plants testament to careful tending and little rain. What struck him most, though, was not the building's shabby condition but the signs of life that pulsed around them like a heartbeat. Laundry fluttered on lines strung between posts, tiny shirts and dresses dancing in the breeze. Someone had built a swing from a rope and board beneath the lone oak tree. Chalk drawings decorated the steps of the main building, flowers and stick figures and what might have been a horse. Drawn with the confident imprecision of childhood, as the wagon approached, children began emerging from doorways and shadows like prairie dogs peering from their holes. They came cautiously at first, then with growing excitement as they recognized Mary Catherine. By the time Ethan pulled the horses to a stop, they were surrounded by a sea of young faces, all turned upward with the kind of unguarded joy that only children could manage. Sister Mary Catherine, a girl of perhaps 10 with red braids, threw herself at the wagon before it fully stopped. You were gone so long, we thought maybe... I'm back now, Sarah. Mary Catherine climbed down and caught the girl in a quick embrace. And I've brought someone to meet you. Ethan found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from 24 pairs of eyes. They ranged in age from a toddler clinging to an older girl's skirt to boys nearly grown, all bearing the particular watchfulness of children who had learned too early that adults could not always be trusted. Their clothes were patched and mended, their faces clean but marked by the lean look of those who knew hunger as a regular companion. Children, Mary Catherine said, her voice carrying the authority of practice. This is Mr. Cole. He's brought supplies for supper tonight. The announcement sparked a ripple of excitement, but the children remained where they were, waiting for permission to approach the wagon. Ethan was struck by their discipline, not the fearful obedience of the cowed, but the natural order of a family that had learned to function as one unit for survival. A boy of perhaps 16 stepped forward, his shoulders already broad with the promise of the man he would become. I'm Daniel, he said, extending a work-calloused hand. I help Sister Mary Catherine with the heavy work. Ethan shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and steady gaze. Ethan Cole, pleased to meet you, Daniel. Can we help unload the wagon? This from a girl of 12 or so, her dark hair plaited neatly but her dress bearing patches upon patches. Emma, mind your manners, Mary Catherine chided gently. It's all right, Ethan said. Many hands make light work, as my mother used to say. The next hour passed in a blur of activity that had the organized chaos of a well-rehearsed dance. The older children formed a line from the wagon to the kitchen, passing sacks and packages with careful efficiency. The younger ones were assigned to sort and inventory, their faces growing brighter with each new item that emerged from the supplies. Ethan found himself drawn into the rhythm despite his usual preference for solitude. A small boy named Timothy, perhaps 6 years old, appointed himself Ethan's shadow, chattering constantly about the garden and the new kittens in the barn and how Sister Mary Catherine could make bread from almost nothing. A pair of twin girls, Lucy and Lily, shyly offered to show him the chicken coop, where 4 scrawny hens produced barely enough eggs to go around. Through it all, he watched Mary Catherine. She moved among the children like a conductor directing an orchestra, anticipating needs before they were voiced, settling disputes with a quiet word, somehow managing to be everywhere at once without seeming hurried. When little Anna, barely 3, scraped her knee on the wagon wheel, Mary Catherine was there with a clean rag and gentle words before the tears fully formed. When the older boys started to argue over who would carry the heaviest sack, a single look from her restored harmony. This was not the detached benevolence of charity work or the grim duty of obligation. This was love in its most practical form, patient, sacrificial, and utterly without pretense. Mr. Cole? The voice belonged to Sarah, the red-haired girl who had greeted them first. Are you going to stay for supper? Ethan glanced toward Mary Catherine, who was helping Timothy carry a small sack of beans that was almost as big as he was. I don't know. That's up to Sister Mary Catherine. She always says there's room at our table for anyone who needs feeding. Sarah said matter-of-factly, and you brought the food, so I reckon you've earned a place. The kitchen was a testament to making do with what was available. The stove was ancient and temperamental, requiring constant attention to maintain heat. The long wooden table bore the scars of countless meals and the careful mending that came from having no money for replacement. Mismatched chairs and benches provided seating for the entire household, though Ethan suspected the youngest children often shared seats. But as the children gathered around that scarred table, heads bowed while Mary Catherine said grace over their simple meal of beans and bacon and fresh bread made from the flour he'd provided, Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. The profound gratitude in their voices as they thanked God for the unexpected feast, the way they automatically saved the best pieces for the smallest among them, the gentle correction when someone forgot their manners. All of it spoke of a family bound not by blood but by something stronger. After supper, as the older children cleared dishes and the younger ones settled in the main room for evening story time, Ethan found himself alone with Mary Catherine on the front porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the stained glass windows in churches he'd known as a child. They're remarkable, he said finally. Mary Catherine smiled, but there was exhaustion in the curve of her mouth. They're children. They deserve better than what the world has given them so far. You've given them something better. You've given them a home. For now. The words came out heavier than she'd intended. But Randall wasn't making idle threats. Mr. DeCole, the county records show taxes in arrears, legal complications about the land ownership. Sister Margaret was not careful about such things. She believed faith would provide, but faith doesn't pay lawyers or satisfy government demands. Ethan was quiet for a moment, watching little Timothy chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. How much? More than we could raise in 10 years of bake sales and charity collections. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening was still warm. Randall has been patient because he knows I have nowhere to turn. No family, no connections, no legal standing beyond what the church provides, and the church. She shrugged. The church has its own concerns, but a husband would change that. A husband would give me legal protection, give the children legal protection. Make it much harder for someone like Randall to simply take what he wants. She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the day. That's what I'm offering to trade for, Mr. Cole. Legal protection and a man willing to stand between these children and the world that sees them as inconvenient. Ethan stood and walked to the edge of the porch. His hands braced against the railing. Behind him, he could hear Mary Catherine's quiet breathing, the distant sound of children preparing for bed, the settling noises of a household finding peace at the end of the day. "I've never been much for staying in one place," he said without turning around. "I know. Never had a family of my own. Never figured I was cut out for it. I know that too." He turned back to her, studying her face in the growing darkness. "What makes you think I won't just take what you're offering and leave when things get difficult?" Mary Catherine was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you could have ridden away this afternoon when I made my proposal. You could have taken the supplies back to town and found easier charity to bestow. Instead, you came here. You sat at our table. You listened to Timothy's stories about the garden and let the twins show you every chicken we own." She stood and smoothed her skirts, preparing to go inside. "A man who would do all that isn't the kind who abandons children when things get difficult." As she reached for the door handle, Ethan spoke again. "Sister Mary Catherine." "Yes?" "Those children are going to sleep with full bellies tonight. That's my second promise to you." Part 4. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Copper Creek, carried on the wings of gossip that flew swifter than any telegraph wire. By the time the morning sun had burned the dew from the wooden sidewalks, half the town knew that Sister Mary Catherine had been seen riding into the valley with a strange man, their wagon loaded heavy with enough supplies to feed an army. By noon, the other half had heard, and the story had grown in the telling until some swore they'd seen the nun laughing like a schoolgirl and the stranger's arm around her waist. Mrs. Abigail Morrison, wife of the bank president and self-appointed guardian of public morality, was the first to voice what others whispered behind cupped hands and drawn curtains. She stood in the center of Patterson's dry goods, her black silk dress rustling with indignation as she addressed anyone within earshot. "It's unseemly," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as gospel. "A woman who has taken vows, carrying on with some drifter she met on the street. What kind of example does that set for those poor children?" Mrs. Helen Patterson, who had known Mary Catherine since the young woman first arrived in town, continued folding bolts of calico with deliberate precision. "Perhaps you should concern yourself with facts before you start spreading tales." "Abigail." "Facts?" Mrs. Morrison's eyebrows arched toward her perfectly arranged gray hair. "The facts are plain enough. She's forgotten her calling, forgotten her duty to God, all for the attention of some smooth-talking stranger. Mark my words, she'll abandon those children the moment he tires of playing house with a fallen nun." The words hit their mark in the small crowd that had gathered. Several heads nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The power of suggestion, once planted, grew quickly in fertile ground. By evening, the story had reached Sheriff Randall, carried by Deputy Willis, who possessed more eagerness than sense. Randall listened from behind his desk, his thick fingers drumming against the scarred wood as a slow smile spread across his face. "Interesting development," he murmured, leaning back in his chair until it creaked under his weight. "Very interesting indeed. What do you want me to do about it, Sheriff?" Willis asked, his young face earnest with the desire to please. "Nothing yet, but keep your ears open. When a woman starts making desperate choices, she usually makes foolish ones too. And foolish choices." Randall's smile widened, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "Well, they tend to solve themselves if a man is patient enough to wait. The next morning brought Reverend Samuel Hayes to the orphanage, his black buggy raising a small cloud of dust as it approached the main building. He was a thin, angular man with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors, and his disapproval was evident in every line of his rigid posture as he climbed down from his seat. Mary Catherine met him at the door, her face calm but her hands betraying her nervousness as she smoothed her apron. "Reverend Hayes, this is unexpected." "Sister." His greeting was curt, lacking any of the warmth that should have existed between servants of the same faith. "I believe we need to discuss some concerning reports that have reached my ears." They sat in the small parlor that served as Mary Catherine's office, its spare furnishings reflecting both the poverty of the institution and the simplicity of religious life. Through the thin walls, they could hear the sounds of children at their morning lessons, Daniel reading aloud to the younger ones, Emma helping with arithmetic. "There are rumors circulating about your association with a certain stranger in town," Reverend Hayes began, his pale eyes studying her face for signs of guilt. "Rumors that suggest you may have forgotten the sacred nature of your vows." Mary Catherine kept her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady despite the accusation in his tone. "I have forgotten nothing about my calling, Reverend. My first duty is to these children, to keep them safe, fed and sheltered. Everything else is secondary. Your first duty is to God," he corrected sharply. "And God does not look kindly upon those who use his house as a marketplace for worldly negotiations. What exactly are you suggesting?" Reverend Hayes leaned forward, his thin frame radiating disapproval. "I'm suggesting that a woman who would consider abandoning her sacred vows for the sake of some imagined security has already fallen from grace. I'm suggesting that perhaps these children would be better served by an institution run by someone whose commitment to righteousness isn't quite so flexible." The threat was clear, wrapped though it was in religious language. Mary Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach, but her voice remained level. "These children have a home here. They're cared for, loved, educated according to Christian principles. What more could any institution provide? Moral leadership that doesn't compromise itself the moment circumstances become difficult." He stood, brushing imaginary dust from his black coat. "I'll be speaking with the church authorities in Denver. Sister, I suggest you spend some time in prayer, considering whether your current path truly serves God's will or merely your own worldly concerns." After he left, Mary Catherine sat alone in the small parlor, listening to the sounds of life continuing around her. Through the window, she could see little Timothy and Anna playing with corncob dolls in the shade of the oak tree, their laughter bright as birdsong. In the kitchen, she could hear Emma humming as she helped prepare the midday meal, using the supplies that Ethan had provided. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention back to the window. Ethan rode up on a sturdy bay mare, his saddlebags bulging with what looked like tools. He'd been gone since dawn, riding back to town for reasons he hadn't explained, leaving her to wonder if the weight of her proposal had finally driven him away. But here he was, dismounting with the easy grace of a man comfortable in the saddle, his attention already turning to the sagging porch railing that had been threatening to collapse for months. Several of the older boys emerged from the barn where they'd been doing chores, drawn by curiosity about his return. Mary Catherine stepped onto the porch as Ethan began unloading tools from his saddlebags. A hammer, nails, pieces of lumber that looked suspiciously expensive for someone with no permanent income. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You've returned." "Said I would." He glanced up at her, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if braced against bad news. "Something wrong?" "Reverend Hayes paid a visit this morning. He's concerned," about the rumors circulating in town. Ethan set down his hammer and straightened, his eyes searching her face. What kind of rumors? The kind that suggest a woman who would consider marriage to a stranger is no longer fit to care for children. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture that was becoming habitual when she spoke of threats to the orphanage. He's threatening to contact the church authorities, possibly recommend that the children be transferred to another institution. And you're worried they'll listen to him. I'm worried they'll see an opportunity to close a troublesome charity that's been nothing but expense and difficulty since Sister Margaret died. Her voice cracked slightly on the words. These children have been moved enough. Mr. Cole. They've been unwanted enough. They deserve better than to be shuffled around like livestock whenever adults decide they're inconvenient. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving over the children who had gathered to watch him work. Daniel stood with the younger boys, his protective stance suggesting he'd already appointed himself their guardian. Emma had appeared in the doorway, her arms dusted with flour from baking bread. Even the smallest ones had crept closer, drawn by the promise of something being fixed rather than falling apart. Well then, Ethan said finally, hefting his hammer with deliberate purpose. I guess we'd better give them something different to talk about. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, he called out to Daniel. Son, you know anything about fixing porches? Daniel's face lit up with the eager pride of a young man being treated as an adult. Some, sir. I've helped patch the roof and mended the chicken coop. Good. How about the rest of you boys? Anyone afraid of a little honest work? The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Even Timothy, barely big enough to hold a nail straight, insisted he could help. As the impromptu work crew organized itself, Mary Catherine watched with growing amazement as Ethan transformed a simple repair job into something that looked suspiciously like a lesson in manhood for the boys, and a demonstration of competence for anyone who might be watching. He worked with the patient skill of someone accustomed to solving problems with his hands. But more than that, he worked like a man who intended to stay, measuring twice, building to last, creating something that would endure long past the present crisis. When Emma brought water for the workers, he thanked her with the same courtesy he might show a lady in her finest dress. When little Anna toddled over to help by handing him nails one at a time, he accepted each offering with solemn gratitude. By afternoon, word had spread that the stranger was still at the orphanage, not just visiting but working, building, improving, investing his time and labor in a place that only mattered to him if he intended to make it matter. Mrs. Gunn Morrison sent her eldest son to check on the children's welfare, but he returned with nothing more scandalous to report than the sight of a man teaching boys how to properly swing a hammer and measure lumber. As the sun began to slant toward evening, Ethan put the finishing touches on the new porch railing. It was solid, level, and built to withstand years of children swinging on it and weather wearing at it. The boys stood back to admire their handiwork, their faces flushed with the satisfaction that came from building something useful with their own hands. Looks good, Daniel said, running his hand along the smooth wood. Looks like it'll last. That's the idea, Ethan replied, gathering his tools. A thing's only worth building if it's built to last. Mary Catherine, who had been watching from the kitchen window while preparing supper, stepped onto the newly repaired porch. The difference was remarkable. What had been a hazard that required constant vigilance was now solid, safe, reliable. Mr. Cole, she said, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. Thank you. No thanks needed. Just keeping my promises. He secured the last of his tools in the saddlebag, then turned to face her fully. Sister Mary Catherine, about those rumors the Reverend mentioned. Yes? Maybe it's time people had something true to talk about instead of something they're making up. His storm-gray eyes held hers steadily. Maybe it's time I gave you a different kind of answer to your proposal. Part 5. The words hung between them like a promise half-made, weighted with possibility and the kind of hope that could either lift a person up or crush them entirely. Mary Catherine felt her heart quicken, though whether from anticipation or fear, she couldn't say. The evening light painted everything in shades of gold and amber, making even the worn boards of the newly repaired porch seem touched with something precious. "What kind of answer?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. 3 riders emerged from the tree line that marked the border of the orphanage property, their silhouettes dark against the dying light. Even at a distance, Mary Catherine recognized the lead rider's bulk and the casual arrogance in his posture. Sheriff Randall had come calling, and he hadn't come alone. "Get the children inside," Ethan said quietly, his demeanor shifting from contemplative to alert in the space of a heartbeat. Now. Mary Catherine moved with practiced efficiency, calling the children in for evening prayers earlier than usual. Daniel, ever perceptive, caught the urgency in her tone and began herding the younger ones toward the door without question. Within moments, the porch was empty save for Mary Catherine and Ethan, who stood side by side as the 3 riders approached. Randall dismounted with deliberate slowness, his spurs jingling with each step as he approached the porch. His companions, Deputy Willis and a man Mary Catherine didn't recognize but whose clothes marked him as someone from outside Copper Creek, remained mounted, their presence clearly intended as intimidation. "Evening, sister," Randall said, touching his hat brim in mock courtesy. His pale eyes moved to Ethan, taking in the man's relaxed stance and the tool belt still hanging at his waist. "Mr. Cole, isn't it? Heard you've been making yourself quite at home here." "Sheriff." Ethan's greeting was neutral, but Mary Catherine could sense the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. "Something we can help you with?" "In matter of fact, there is." Randall's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Been getting reports about some irregularities concerning this establishment. Thought I should come out and assess the situation personally." "What kind of irregularities?" Mary Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Well now, that's the thing about irregularities. They tend to pile up once you start looking close." Randall climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy on the new wood. "Got reports of unmarried folks cohabitating in a house meant for children. Got concerns about the moral atmosphere these young ones are being exposed to." The 3rd man dismounted and approached, pulling a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. He was thin and pale, with the soft hands of someone who worked with papers rather than tools, and his clothes marked him as a city man trying to look official in frontier territory. "This here's Mr. Frederick Ashworth," Randall continued, gesturing to the newcomer. "He's what you might call a specialist in child welfare. Represents some folks in the territorial capital who take interest in situations like this." Ashworth stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes cataloging every detail of the orphanage with the calculating gaze of a man who made his living finding fault. "Sister Mary Catherine, I presume. I'm here to conduct an evaluation of this facility and its management." "By whose authority?" Ethan asked, his voice still level but carrying an edge that made Deputy Willis shift nervously in his saddle. "By the authority of the territorial government and the Christian decency that says children shouldn't be exposed to immoral influences." Randall answered before Ashworth could speak. "Now, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding, but when concerned citizens bring complaints—" "What citizens?" Mary Catherine's voice carried a steel that surprised even herself. Name them. Randall's smile widened. Now, sister, you know I can't reveal the identities of folks who come forward in good conscience, but the concerns are real enough. A woman who's taken sacred vows, living in close quarters with a man she barely knows, setting an example for impressionable children. We're not living in close quarters, Mary Catherine said firmly. Mr. Cole has been helping with repairs and has taken his meals with us, nothing more. Yet, Randall said, the single word loaded with insinuation. But folks are wondering what happens when helping turns into something else. What happens when a woman forgets her calling for the sake of worldly desires? Ethan stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Mary Catherine and the sheriff. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and Randall's eyes sharpened with interest. Sheriff, Ethan said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from a man comfortable with confrontation. I think you're operating under some false assumptions about the situation here. Am I now? And what assumptions might those be? The assumption that Sister Mary Catherine is acting without proper guidance or protection. Ethan reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. The assumption that her decisions are being made in isolation, without legal standing or community support. He handed the paper to Mary Catherine, whose eyes widened as she read the contents. It was a marriage license, properly filled out and notarized, bearing both their names and dated that very afternoon. You see, Sheriff, Ethan continued, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Sister Mary Catherine isn't going to be Sister Mary Catherine much longer. She's going to be Mrs. Ethan Cole, with all the legal protections and social standing that marriage provides. And as her husband, I'll be taking a very personal interest in anyone who threatens her or the children in her care. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of horses shifting restlessly and the distant call of a night bird. Randall's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, while Ashworth shuffled through his papers with the nervous energy of a man whose carefully laid plans had just been overturned. When? Randall asked finally, his voice tight with suppressed anger. Tomorrow afternoon, Mary Catherine said, finding her voice at last. Reverend Hayes has already agreed to perform the ceremony. The lie came smoothly, born of desperation and the sudden understanding that Ethan had given her the weapon she needed to protect her children. This is highly irregular, Ashworth protested, his city accent sharp with disapproval. A woman cannot simply abandon religious vows for the sake of convenience. She's not abandoning anything, Ethan said, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the man with unwavering intensity. She's choosing to serve God in a different way, as a wife and mother to children who need both protection and love. Last time I checked, that was considered a sacred calling too. Randall's hand drifted toward his gun belt, a gesture so casual it might have been unconscious. Mighty convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Right when questions are being asked about the propriety of this place. I'd say it's perfect timing, Ethan replied, his own hand resting easily at his side but ready to move if necessary. Sometimes a man knows what he wants the moment he sees it, and sometimes protecting what matters is worth any amount of inconvenience. Deputy Willis, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, cleared his throat nervously. Sheriff, maybe we should nothing, Randall snapped, his composure finally cracking. This whole thing stinks of desperation and deception. A woman doesn't just decide to marry a stranger unless she's got something to hide, or unless she's got something to protect, Mary Catherine said, stepping forward to stand beside Ethan. 27 children who deserve better than to be pawns in whatever game you're playing. Sheriff. Game? Randall's voice rose, causing his horse to sidestep nervously. I'm trying to protect those children from being raised by a woman who'd sell herself to the first man who offered security. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Mary Catherine felt the color drain from her face. But before she could respond, Ethan moved. One moment he was standing calmly beside her. The next, he was nose to nose with Randall, his voice deadly quiet. "Sheriff, I'm going to give you one chance to apologize to my fiancé for that remark. One chance to remember that you're speaking to a lady who's devoted her life to caring for children nobody else wanted." Randall's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he found himself looking down the barrel of Ethan's Colt, drawn so quickly that none of the three men had seen the movement. "I wouldn't," Ethan said conversationally. "I really wouldn't." The tableau held for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then Deputy Willis spoke up, his young voice cracking with nervousness. "Sheriff, maybe we should head back to town. Report back to the territorial office that everything here seems in order." Ashworth was already backing toward his horse, his face pale with the realization that his comfortable world of papers and regulations had suddenly become something much more dangerous. "Yes. I think perhaps a follow-up visit after the wedding would be more appropriate." Randall stood frozen for another moment, his eyes locked with Ethan's. Then, slowly, he stepped back, his hands moving deliberately away from his weapon. "This isn't over," he said, his voice thick with barely controlled rage. "No," Ethan agreed, holstering his gun with the same fluid motion that had drawn it. "It's not. But the next time you come here, you'll be dealing with a married man protecting his family, and keep that in mind." As the three men mounted their horses and rode away, Mary Catherine stood trembling on the porch she had watched Ethan repair that very afternoon. The marriage license crinkled in her shaking hands as she stared at the man beside her. This stranger who had just claimed her as his fiancé and faced down armed men to protect her and the children. "Mr. Cole," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "What have we just done?" Ethan turned to her, his expression gentle despite the hardness that had been in his eyes moments before. "We've given ourselves a fighting chance, Mrs. Cole. And tomorrow, we're going to make it legal." From inside the house came the sound of children's voices raised in evening prayer, their innocent words drifting through the windows like a benediction on the choices that had just been made in their name. Part 6. The morning of the county fair dawned bright and merciless, with the kind of crystalline sky that promised heat by noon and gossip by evening. Mary Catherine stood before the cracked mirror in her small room, adjusting the collar of her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had belonged to Sister Margaret and had been carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. It was the closest thing to a wedding dress she possessed, and in a few hours, it would serve that very purpose. Her hands trembled as she pinned her dark hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Through the thin walls, she could hear the children preparing for the day's festivities with the kind of excitement that only came from the promise of rare treats and public entertainment. The fair meant games and contests, music and dancing, and for the first time in months, a chance for the orphanage children to feel like they belonged to something larger than their small, struggling community. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Sister Mary Catherine." Emma's voice carried the careful formality the older children used when they sensed something important was happening. "Mr. Cole is here with the wagon." "Thank you, Emma, I'll be right there." In the kitchen, she found controlled chaos. The older children were packing baskets with the special treats they'd prepared for the fair, cookies made with precious sugar, bread still warm from the oven, and jars of preserves made from the wild berries the children had gathered throughout the summer. It was their contribution to the community gathering, and Mary Catherine knew how much pride they took in having something worthwhile to offer. Ethan stood near the doorway, hat in hand, wearing his best shirt and the black jacket he'd retrieved from his saddlebags the night before. He looked like what he was, a man preparing for his wedding day with quiet determination rather than joy. When their eyes met, she saw understanding there, and something that might have been regret for the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. "Ready?" he asked simply. "As ready as one can be for such things," she replied, accepting the light shawl that Sarah pressed into her hands. The ride to town was a peculiar mixture of festivity and solemnity. The children chattered excitedly about the fair, pointing out wildflowers along the roadside and speculating about the contests they might enter. But beneath their excitement lay an undercurrent of awareness that this day would change everything for their small family. Daniel, driving the second wagon with the older boys, kept glancing back at Mary Catherine with the protective concern of a son watching his mother embark on an uncertain journey. Copper Creek had transformed overnight into something approaching a carnival. Colorful bunting stretched between buildings, and the sounds of hammering and sawing filled the air as merchants and entertainers set up their booths. The aroma of roasting meat and fresh-baked pies drifted from the area near the church where the ladies' auxiliary had established their food tables. Children from town ran between the displays with the wild energy of youth temporarily freed from adult supervision. But beneath the festive atmosphere, Mary Catherine could feel the weight of watching eyes and hushed conversations. Word of her impending marriage had spread through the community like wildfire, and the speculation had grown in the telling until some versions bore little resemblance to reality. "There she is," Mrs. Morrison announced loudly enough to be heard 3 blocks away. She stood near the church steps with a cluster of women, her black silk dress making her look like a crow among sparrows. Bold as brass, showing herself in public as if nothing unseemly had occurred. "Perhaps because nothing unseemly has occurred," Mrs. Patterson replied crisply, stepping away from the group with the kind of pointed gesture that spoke volumes about her opinion of the gossip. Ethan helped Mary Catherine down from the wagon, his hand steady and warm against hers. "Remember," he said quietly, "we're not doing anything wrong. We're protecting children and making an honest living together. Anyone who has a problem with that is revealing more about themselves than about us." The morning passed in a blur of activities that felt both normal and surreal. The orphanage children threw themselves into the fair with enthusiasm, entering contests and games with the competitive spirit of youth. Timothy won 2nd place in the egg and spoon race, his face glowing with pride as he showed off his ribbon. The twin girls, Lucy and Lily, took 1st prize for their apple preserves, an achievement that had them dancing with joy. But through it all, Mary Catherine was aware of the undercurrent of tension that rippled through the crowd whenever she and Ethan appeared together. Some people greeted them with genuine warmth, Mr. Hensley from the general store, Dr. Benjamin Walsh, who had treated several of the children over the years, and a handful of farmers who had benefited from the orphanage children's help during harvest times. Others turned away entirely, their disapproval written clearly in their averted gazes and stiff shoulders. It was near noon, when the sun had reached its punishing peak and the crowd had gathered around the makeshift stage for the speaking contests. That Sheriff Randall made his move. He had positioned himself near the platform where the town's prominent citizens traditionally addressed the crowd, and when Mayor Franklin called for community announcements, Randall stepped forward with the confident stride of a man who believed himself in the right. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd. "Before we continue with our festivities, I believe there's a matter of community concern that needs addressing." A hush fell over the gathering, the kind of silence that preceded either celebration or disaster. Mary Catherine felt Ethan's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own in a gesture of solidarity that was noticed by everyone present. "Now, I don't like to speak ill of anyone," Randall continued, his tone suggesting the exact opposite. "But when the welfare of innocent children is at stake, a man has a duty to speak up. I'm talking about the situation out at the orphanage, where a woman who took sacred vows is now planning to marry a stranger she met just days ago." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some faces showed interest, others discomfort, and a few displayed the hungry anticipation of those who found entertainment in the misfortunes of others. "Sheriff Randall," Dr. Walsh called out from the crowd, his physician's authority lending weight to his words. "Are you suggesting that marriage is somehow improper? Because last time I checked, it was considered a Christian sacrament." "Not when it's entered into for the wrong reasons," Randall shot back. "Not when it's a desperate attempt to avoid accountability for questionable behavior." Mary Catherine felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward. His movement was casual, unhurried, but something in his bearing caused the crowd to fall completely silent. "Sheriff," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly without being raised, "I think you're laboring under some misunderstandings about the situation. Maybe I can help clear things up." "Oh, by all means," Randall replied, his smile sharp with anticipated triumph. "First," Ethan continued, "Sister Mary Catherine hasn't taken any vows that prevent her from marriage. She's a lay sister, not a nun, which means she's free to choose marriage if she believes it serves God's purpose better than remaining single. Second, we're not strangers. We're two people who recognize something in each other that was worth building a life around." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But most importantly, Sheriff, I think the real question here isn't about our marriage. I think it's about why a man in your position is so interested in finding fault with a woman who's devoted her life to caring for unwanted children." The shift in the crowd's attention was palpable. Heads turned toward Randall, and Mary Catherine could see doubt beginning to replace the certainty in some faces. "Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly, while several of the farmers who had employed the orphanage children began to mutter among themselves. "That's a serious accusation," Randall said, his face flushing red above his collar. "Is it an accusation, or is it an observation?" Ethan's voice remained level, conversational. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been working pretty hard to find problems with an institution that's been nothing but a blessing to this community. Makes a man wonder what your real interest might be." Old Jake Morrison, Abigail's husband and the president of the town bank, stepped forward from the crowd. He was a small, thin man who rarely spoke in public. But when he did, people listened. "Tom," he said, addressing the sheriff with the familiarity of long acquaintance, "what exactly is your complaint here? Because I've known that girl since she came to town, and I've never seen anything but dedication and sacrifice from her. Those children are fed, clothed, educated, and cared for better than some who have blood parents." "Jake's right," called out Mrs. Ellen Patterson. "Those children have never been a burden on the community. If anything, they've been a help, working harvests, helping with chores, always polite and well-behaved. What more could anyone ask for?" The murmur of agreement that rippled through the crowd seemed to surprise Randall, who had clearly expected more support for his position. His jaw tightened, and Mary Catherine could see him calculating his next move. "You're all missing the point," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "This isn't about the children's behavior. It's about the moral example being set. A woman who would marry a complete stranger for the sake of legal protection is teaching those children that vows don't matter. that commitments can be discarded when they become inconvenient. Sheriff Randall, Mary Catherine said, stepping forward before Ethan could respond. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the stillness. You speak of moral examples and the importance of commitments. But what example does it set when a man uses his authority to attack a woman who has no way to defend herself? What does it teach children when adults use power to bully those who are weaker? She paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd, some sympathetic, some hostile, all watching to see what she would say next. Mr. Cole isn't a stranger to me anymore, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He's a man who saw children who needed protection and offered to provide it. He's a man who works with his hands to repair what's broken and build what's needed. He's a man who keeps his promises. She turned to look at Ethan, and for a moment, their eyes held with an understanding that went deeper than the practical arrangement that had brought them together. And tomorrow, she said, turning back to the crowd, he's going to become my husband, not because we're desperate or deceiving ourselves, but because we've found something worth building together, a family for children who need one, a home for those who have none, and a partnership based on respect and shared purpose. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound, the slow, deliberate clapping of Daniel, the eldest of the orphanage boys. One by one, the other children joined him, their applause growing until it was taken up by Mrs. Patterson, then Dr. Walsh, then Jake Morrison, and finally by half the crowd. Randall stood frozen on the platform, his face a mask of fury and defeat. The public support he had expected had evaporated, replaced by something he clearly hadn't anticipated. Respect for a woman who had spoken truth with quiet courage and a man who had stood beside her when she needed support. Well, Mayor Franklin said finally, stepping onto the platform with the relieved air of a man grateful to move past an awkward situation. I believe congratulations are in order. And now, perhaps we can return to the business of enjoying our community fair. As the crowd began to disperse, returning to the games and contests and simple pleasures of the day, Mary Catherine found herself surrounded by the children, their faces bright with pride and something that looked remarkably like hope. Sister Mary Catherine, little Anna said, tugging at her skirt. Does this mean Mr. Cole is going to be our papa? Mary Catherine looked down at the small, trusting face, then over at Ethan, who was accepting congratulations from Dr. Walsh with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who had just discovered he was part of something larger than himself. Yes, Anna, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I believe it does. Part 7. The sun had barely kissed the horizon when the sound of approaching riders shattered the peaceful evening quiet that had settled over the orphanage. Mary Catherine, who had been helping Emma and the older girls clean up after supper, felt her stomach drop at the familiar jangle of spurs and the deliberate heaviness of horses being ridden hard with purpose rather than pleasure. Through the kitchen window, she counted 6 riders silhouetted against the dying light. Sheriff Randall led them, his bulk unmistakable even in shadow, flanked by Deputy Willis and 4 men she didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with the look of hired hands more comfortable with violence than law enforcement. Children, she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from years of managing crises without alarming the young ones. It's time for evening prayers. Daniel. Would you please gather everyone in the main room? Daniel, now 17 and possessed of the quick instincts of someone who had learned early to read danger in adult voices, nodded once and began herding the smaller children away from the windows. Emma followed suit, her face pale but determined as she guided Lucy and Lily toward the interior of the house. Ethan emerged from the barn where he'd been checking on a sick calf. His shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands still dusty from the work. The moment he saw the riders, his entire bearing changed. The easy, unhurried movements that had characterized his work around the orphanage were replaced by the fluid alertness of a man who had faced armed conflict before and survived it. "Mary Catherine," he called softly, not taking his eyes off the approaching men. "Get everyone inside. Bar the doors." She moved quickly but without panic, ensuring the children were gathered in the safest part of the house while keeping watch through the front window. Several of the older boys had positioned themselves near the windows despite her instructions to stay back, their young faces tight with the kind of protective fury that came from watching someone threaten their family. Randall dismounted with theatrical slowness, his spurs ringing against the wooden steps of the newly repaired porch. His companions remained mounted, forming a loose semicircle that effectively blocked any escape route from the main building. The message was clear. This was not a social call, not a social. "Cole," Randall's voice carried easily in the still air. "We need to talk." Ethan stepped into view, positioning himself between the house and the mounted men. In his hands, he carried the shotgun he'd retrieved from the barn, not pointed at anyone, but held with the casual competence of someone who knew how to use it. "Sheriff," Ethan said, his voice level despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "Kind of late for a social visit." "Nothing social about this." Randall's hand rested on his gun butt, a gesture that was noticed by every man present. "Got some questions that need answering, and I got tired of waiting for you to come to town and answer them." "And what questions might those be?" "Questions about who you are and where you came from. Questions about why a man with your particular skills just happened to wander into our quiet little town right when certain situations needed resolving." Randall's smile was all teeth and malice. "See, I sent some telegrams after our little conversation at the fair. Amazing what a man can learn when he asks the right questions in the right places." Mary Catherine felt ice settle in her stomach. Through the window, she could see Ethan's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly, the only sign that Randall's words had found their mark. "And what did you learn, Sheriff?" "I learned that Ethan Cole is a name that shows up in some interesting places. Kansas, mostly. Dodge City, specifically. Amazing how many wanted posters have been circulating with that particular name on them." The silence that followed was broken only by the shifting of horses and the creak of leather as the mounted men adjusted their positions. Mary Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Ethan's face in profile, searching for some sign of denial, some indication that Randall was lying or mistaken. She found neither. "Now, I'm not saying you're the same Ethan Cole," Randall continued, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of a cat playing with a mouse. "Could be coincidence. Could be there's more than one man with that name drifting around the territories. But it does raise questions about whether the good sister here knows exactly what kind of man she's planning to marry." "What kind of questions?" Ethan asked, his voice still steady but carrying an edge that made Deputy Willis shift nervously in his saddle. "Questions about a bank robbery in Dodge City last spring. Questions about a sheriff who ended up dead when he tried to arrest the men responsible. Questions about whether a man running from that kind of trouble might be desperate enough to hide behind a woman's skirts and use orphaned children as a shield." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke, poisonous and impossible to ignore. Mary Catherine found herself holding her breath, waiting for Ethan's response, praying for words that would make sense of the terrible possibility that she had entrusted her life and the lives of 27 children to a man who might be everything Randall suggested. "You've got quite an imagination, Sheriff," Ethan said finally. "But imagination isn't evidence." "Maybe not." but it's enough to justify holding you for questioning until we can sort things out. Enough to ensure that these children aren't being put at risk by harboring a fugitive." Randall's hand moved closer to his gun. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to put down that shotgun and come with us peaceful-like. We're going to have a long conversation about your past. And if everything checks out, well, maybe you can come back and play house with the good sister. And if I refuse?" Randall's smile widened. "Then we'll have to discuss the matter right here, right now. And that might not go so well for anyone nearby." The threat to the children was unmistakable, and Mary Catherine saw Ethan's jaw tighten as he calculated his options. 6 armed men against 1, with innocent lives at stake. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and clear. "Interesting proposition," Ethan said, his voice conversational despite the tension crackling in the air. "But I think you're operating under some false assumptions." "Such as?" "Such as assuming I'm alone out here." As if summoned by his words, figures began emerging from the shadows around the orphanage buildings. Daniel appeared at the corner of the barn, a rifle in his hands and the grim determination of a young man protecting his family written across his face. 2 of the local farmers, men whose children had been helped by the orphanage over the years, stepped into view from behind the chicken coop, their own weapons ready. Even old Jake Morrison from the bank had somehow materialized near the vegetable garden, a shotgun cradled in his surprisingly steady arms. "You see, Sheriff," Ethan continued as more figures became visible in the gathering darkness. "Funny thing about communities. When you attack someone they care about, they tend to take it personal." Randall's confidence wavered as he counted the men arrayed against him. What had seemed like overwhelming odds moments before had suddenly become something much more uncertain. His hired guns were looking around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the way the situation had developed. "This is still a legal matter," Randall said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I've got authority." "You've got accusations and suspicions," Dr. Walsh interrupted, stepping into the light with his medical bag in one hand and a pistol in the other. "But unless you've got warrants or proof, what you've got is harassment of decent people." "The man could be a killer." "Could be," agreed Jake Morrison, his banker's precision evident even in the midst of armed confrontation. "But could be isn't good enough when you're threatening children. You want to question him. You do it proper-like. Bring a warrant. Bring proof. Bring something more than gossip and maybes." Mary Catherine watched the standoff develop with a mixture of terror and amazement. These men, farmers and merchants who had never shown more than polite interest in the orphanage, had somehow known to come, had somehow organized themselves to stand between her family and armed threats. The realization that the community had quietly rallied around them despite the gossip and speculation brought tears to her eyes. But beneath her gratitude lay the cold fear that Randall might be right about Ethan. The man she had agreed to marry, the man she had trusted with the lives of the children, might indeed be running from a violent past. The uncertainty gnawed at her with physical pain, making her stomach clench and her hands shake. "This isn't over," Randall said finally, his voice thick with frustrated rage. "Questions like these don't just disappear because you've got friends with guns." "No," Ethan agreed, they don't. But they get answered the right way in the right place by the right people, not by armed men threatening children in the dark." For a moment, the 2 groups faced each other across the yard, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the windows of the house. Then Randall jerked his head toward his men, and they began backing their horses away from the orphanage buildings. "Enjoy your wedding," Randall called out as they prepared to leave. "Might be the last happy day you have for a long time." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, The men who had come to defend the orphanage began to disperse as quietly as they had appeared. Most offered brief words of support to Ethan and Mary Catherine before melting back into the darkness. But Dr. Walsh lingered, his weathered face grave with concern. "Son," he said quietly, approaching Ethan with the careful manner of someone who had learned to read character in decades of medical practice. "I don't know what truth there might be in what Randall said, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I want you to know whatever you've done or haven't done in the past doesn't change what you've done here. These children are better off because of you, and that counts for something." After the doctor left, Mary Catherine stood on the porch facing the man she was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours. The evening star had appeared in the darkening sky, bright and solitary above the horizon, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called with a sound like mourning. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. "I need to know. Is any of it true?" He was silent for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the last light of day as he looked out over the land that had become, in just a few short days, more like home than anywhere he'd known in years. "Some of it," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of honesty that cost him something to give. "Not all, but some." Mary Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the foundation of her carefully constructed new life shift beneath her feet like sand in a flood. When she opened them again, Ethan was watching her with an expression that might have been resignation or relief. The look of a man who had finally stopped running from the truth. "Tell me," she said simply, and in the gathering darkness, with the children safe inside and the sound of their evening prayers drifting through the windows, Ethan Cole began to speak about the man he had been before he became the man she needed him to be. Part 8. The words came slowly at first, like water from a long dry well, each one carefully chosen and weighted with the kind of truth that had been buried beneath months of careful silence. Mary Catherine sat on the porch steps beside Ethan, close enough to hear his quiet voice, but far enough to run if what she learned proved too much to bear. "My name is Ethan Cole," he began, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last traces of sunlight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. "That much is true, but the man Randall described, that was me too, or part of me." The night sounds of the prairie filled the silence between his words. The distant call of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the grass, the gentle lowing of cattle from a neighboring ranch inside the house. The children had settled into their evening routine, their voices a soft murmur of prayers and whispered conversations that spoke of safety and routine and all the things that might be threatened by what she was about to learn. "I was a lawman once," Ethan continued, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Deputy sheriff in a little town in Kansas called Cedar Ridge. Thought I was making a difference. Thought I was one of the good ones. Had a wife named Sarah, a little girl named Beth who would be about Emma's age now if she'd lived." Mary Catherine felt her breath catch at the pain in his voice, the careful way he spoke of people who clearly meant more to him than simple memory. "What happened to them?" "Cholera took Sarah when Beth was 3. I tried to care for the little one myself, but a man with a badge doesn't make much of a mother. My sister Margaret lived in Dodge City, married to a banker, comfortable life, no children of their own. They offered to take Beth, give her things I couldn't provide." He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. "I thought I was doing right by her. Thought she'd be better off with family who could give her a proper home." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade and consequences that had shaped everything that followed. "I visited when I could, brought her little gifts, told her stories. She was happy there, or seemed to be. Margaret's husband, Robert, was good to her, treated her like his own daughter. Ethan's voice grew rougher, edged with something that might have been guilt or rage or both. Then Robert got involved with some men who weren't as honest as his banking business required. Started laundering money for cattle rustlers, providing false papers for stolen herds. Mary Catherine found herself leaning forward despite her fear, drawn into the story despite the danger it might represent to everything she'd built. I didn't know at first. Might never have known if one of the rustlers hadn't gotten careless and left a trail that led back to Robert's bank. When I figured out what was happening, I went to Margaret first, tried to convince her to talk Robert into turning himself in, cooperating with the law in exchange for leniency. But she wouldn't. She was terrified. Said Robert had gotten in too deep, that the men he was dealing with would kill him if he tried to back out. Begged me to look the other way, just this once, for Beth's sake. Ethan stood and walked to the porch railing, his hands gripping the wood he'd repaired just days before. I couldn't do it, wouldn't do it. I was sworn to uphold the law, and I'd seen too many towns torn apart by men who thought they were above it. The weight of his decision hung in the air between them, and Mary Catherine could see the cost of it written in every line of his body. So I did my job, arrested Robert, brought evidence against the whole operation. The trial was quick, too much evidence to deny, too many witnesses to silence. Robert got 10 years in territorial prison. The rustlers got worse. And your sister? Margaret never forgave me. Said I'd destroyed her family for the sake of abstract justice. That I'd chosen the law over the people I was supposed to love. She moved away before Robert's trial ended, took Beth with her. Left word that I wasn't welcome in their lives anymore. Mary Catherine felt her heart clench at the quiet devastation in his voice. She could picture it all too clearly. A man trying to do right by everyone, only to discover that sometimes right came with a price too high to bear. That was 2 years ago, Ethan continued. I tried to find them, tried to write letters, tried to make Margaret understand that I'd had no choice. But she'd covered their tracks well, and after a while, I had to accept that they didn't want to be found. So you left Kansas? Eventually, couldn't stay in Cedar Ridge. Too many memories, too many people who knew what had happened. Resigned my position and started drifting, looking for something that would make sense of what I'd lost. He turned back to face her, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the starlight that had begun to appear in the darkening sky. That's when I made the mistake that put my name on those wanted posters Randall mentioned. Mary Catherine waited, her hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid to hear what came next but knowing she needed to know all of it. I was in Dodge City about 6 months ago, drinking too much, feeling sorry for myself, when I heard shooting from the direction of the First National Bank. By the time I got there, 3 men were coming out with bags of money and hostages, including a woman and her little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. His voice grew harder now, edged with the kind of cold anger that came from seeing innocence threatened. The sheriff was down, gut shot and bleeding. His deputies were pinned down by gunfire, and the robbers were using the woman and child as shields, threatening to kill them if anyone tried to stop their escape. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't stand by and watch another child suffer because adults couldn't find a better way to solve their problems. What did you do? What I was trained to do. What 2 years as a lawman had taught me about dealing with men who would hurt innocent people for money. His voice was matter-of-fact now, devoid of emotion. I waited until they thought they were clear, then followed them out of town, caught up with them about 5 miles south near an old line shack. The silence that followed stretched until Mary Catherine thought she might scream from the tension. When Ethan spoke again, his words were carefully measured, each one chosen with the precision of a man who had relived these moments countless times. I gave them a chance to surrender, called out that I was armed and that they should release the hostages and throw down their guns. They laughed and said they'd kill the woman and child before they'd give up their take. His jaw tightened. So I made sure they couldn't. You killed them? 2 of them. The third, the leader. I wounded bad enough that he couldn't fight, but not bad enough that he couldn't talk. Turned out he was wanted for murder in 3 territories, and his partners weren't much better. The woman and child were unharmed. Mary Catherine tried to process what she was hearing, to reconcile the gentle man who had repaired their porch and listened patiently to Timothy's endless chatter with the efficient killer he was describing. But if you saved those people, if you stopped criminals who were already wanted for murder, why are you on wanted posters? Ethan's smile was bitter as winter wind. Because the wounded man told a different story. Said I was part of the gang, that I'd shot my partners in a dispute over the money. Said the woman and child could vouch for him because they'd seen me with the others earlier. He shrugged. The woman was too frightened to remember clearly, and a 5-year-old's testimony doesn't carry much weight in court. By the time the truth might have come out, I was already being hunted as an outlaw. So you ran. I ran. Been running ever since, until I rode into Copper Creek and saw a woman who reminded me that there were still things in this world worth protecting instead of just surviving. The confession hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Mary Catherine sat in the darkness, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat and trying to understand what this revelation meant for the future she had thought she was building. Mary Catherine, Ethan said quietly, I won't blame you if you can't go through with the wedding tomorrow. Won't blame you if you decide the risk is too great, if you think the children would be safer without me here. She was quiet for so long that he began to wonder if she had already made her decision. Then, slowly, she stood and walked to stand beside him at the porch railing, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap in her hair. Those men who came tonight, she said finally. The ones who stood with you against Randall. Do you think they would have done that if they believed you were really the kind of man the wanted posters describe? I don't know. I do. Her voice was steady now, carrying a certainty that surprised them both. Dr. Walsh has been practicing medicine for 30 years. He's seen every kind of man this territory produces, good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. Jake Morrison built his bank by being able to judge character better than most people judge horseflesh. Those farmers have families to protect, and they wouldn't risk their lives standing with someone they thought was truly dangerous. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. More than that, I've watched you with the children. I've seen how Timothy follows you around like a devoted puppy. How Emma trusts you enough to ask your opinion about everything from baking bread to mending clothes. Children know things about people that adults sometimes miss. They can sense violence, sense danger, sense dishonesty in ways that we've learned to rationalize away. Mary Catherine, I'm not finished. Her voice carried a strength that silenced his protest. You could have ridden away when Randall made his accusations. Could have disappeared into the night rather than face questions about your past. Instead, you stayed. You trusted me with the truth, even knowing it might cost you everything you'd found here. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers warm against his skin. The man on those wanted posters might have my name and my face, Ethan said quietly. But he's not the man I am when I'm with you and these children. That man was lost and angry and making choices out of pain rather than hope. And the man you are now? Ethan looked out over the orphanage grounds, taking in the neat garden rows, the repaired buildings, the swing hanging from the oak tree where the children played. Then he looked at the woman beside him, this remarkable person who had offered him not just her hand in marriage, but a chance at redemption he'd never dared hope for. "The man I am now," he said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both, "wants to spend the rest of his life proving that some promises are worth keeping, no matter what the cost." In the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, marking the passage of another day and the approach of a tomorrow that would change everything for both of them. Inside the house, the children had finally settled into sleep, their breathing a gentle rhythm that spoke of trust and safety and all the things that made the risk worthwhile. "Then I suppose," Mary Catherine said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "we have a wedding to prepare for.